conversation is for us, so it's important to ensure that we work together in this particular conversation. I think agriculture in Africa has been one of the critical sectors that is impacted by climate change, and the implications of climate change on Africa's agriculture sector, as well as the forest and land use sector, has been quite enormous. As early as 2003, thereabout, again, there were deeper conversations on what needs to be done. The Comprehensive African Agriculture and Development Program, which we famously call as CADAP, came in as a transformative agenda, transformative program to revolutionize Africa agriculture sector. Within the CADAP itself, there was a critical pillar, and this pillar So I was saying within the Comprehensive African Agriculture and Development Program, there was a critical pillar, and that is pillar 1, which was actually looking at sustainable management of agriculture sector and looking at how best to strengthen sustainability within agriculture sector. Pillar 1 essentially carried the climate change adaptation elements, which are extremely critical for agriculture sector in that particular regard. Unfortunately, it was the most poorly implemented pillar. It was the worst in terms of resourcing, and therefore, again, not much progress was registered in that particular regard. Coming down to Malabo Declaration came in with a much more sharper focus on addressing issues of climate change. But again, the pronouncement around Malabo declarations never materialized, and nothing or no much progress was made in terms of implementing transformative action that enable African agriculture to respond to issues of climate change. So there are some certain fundamental questions then that we start to ask ourselves. Why that particular context? Within the global financing architecture, by that time, those who do reflect quite well, the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program facility was initiated. When it was initiated, it had quite a sharper focus in terms of putting resources to be accessible to farmers at the front line of climate crisis. There were two windows, the private window and the public window. I'm just trying to lay these historical perspectives so that, again, they inform our conversation. These two windows were quite important in terms of where people are going to put resources. Unfortunately, the private sector players in Global North opted to put resources under the private window rather than the public window, and therefore agriculture continued to suffer perpetual lack of resources that can actually connect with communities at the front line of climate crisis. We felt in this particular COP, and particularly when we are looking at the global goal on adaptation, where we are premising some certain indicators to drive the global goal on adaptation, where we are also clear on the kind of targets that we want to set around adaptation through the global goal on adaptation, but where we are equally very clear that the new collective quantified goal must address priorities that are relevant to the context of Africa. It is indeed an important space for us to do a bit of introspection. Introspection looking at what has worked, what has not worked. What are those barriers, and how do we overcome those barriers, which are extremely critical in terms of preventing resources from flowing to the frontline communities, but more usefully, how do we ensure that we are able to accelerate climate financing for adaptation in agriculture and other natural resource sectors, which are extremely critical. That will be our topic of conversation today. And to implement this activity, we have broad-based partnerships that draws quite a number of actors, both in Global North and Global South, but also that brings the richness of the experience that is drawn from across Africa, comprising Tree Aid, Alliance for Biodiversity International, and CGIAR, the Ban Ki-moon Center, and Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Those are the institutions that are actually involved in this particular process. For purposes of structure and process, this event will be structured in 3 parts. We will have a presentation of some analysis around where climate finance is flowing, hinged on the analysis of the national determined contribution. And then quickly we will go into a panel discussion that will actually analyze and dissect those findings. And then we'll quickly flow into a conversation that is forward-looking in terms of how we can skew the new collective quantified goal and the GGA to serve the aspirations of Africa and enable overcome these barriers. That will be the general structure of the process. And to start us off, I want to invite Pedro Chilambe, who is the co-lead on Climate Finance, Alliance for Biodiversity International, and CGIAR, to give us an overview of what came out of the analysis that they've been actually undertaking in terms of financing for agriculture sector in the current context. Over to you, Pedro.
So, good morning, everyone, and I hope that you're able to hear me. My name is Pedro Chilambe, working with the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CGIAR, a research organization part of the CGIAR. And we're definitely happy to have you here today to be able to look at some of the research that we've done around the climate finance flows in the region of the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. We have a policy brief that we've put together coming from the analysis and the study that we've done to a report which we will be putting out in a few weeks. But we thought that it would be good to bring together some of the results and findings from this report to bring about a discussion of how we can overcome the barriers to access to finance, both in terms of quantity and quality of finance for this region that is quite very vulnerable in the continent. So there is a QR code. You can scan it. I will leave it here for just a few seconds as I kick off. So just to provide a little bit of context, today is Finance Day. And we are in the midst of negotiations around the new collective goal on climate finance, where both developed and developing countries are looking to come to an agreement to the amount of finance that will be provided from developed countries to developing countries to support climate action towards the implementation of the Paris Agreement towards 2030. So we, on our end, decided that it would be a good piece of support to the continent to help negotiators understand what the challenges are at the moment and what the reality is in terms of finance in the continent. There are not a lot of studies that look at what is happening around Africa. Of course, CPI has been doing quite a few reports assessing the situation in the continent and in some countries, but there is more need for these kind of studies, and we believed that it was important for us to take a look at how climate finance is flowing, where it's going, who it's reaching and how, and we did try to shed some light in terms of these points. So as I mentioned, of course, the continent is highly vulnerable to climate change. When we look at the Sahel and Horn of Africa region, you find most of these countries suffering from the compounding burden of conflict, climate, and food security. And definitely this is a very strong character within this region that has created increased food insecurity, but also a lot of migration in the region. When we look at what countries in the region have put forward in terms of their nationally determined contributions, the region as a whole proposed about $55 billion towards 2030 for the agriculture sector. When you look at this number, you need to put this in the context of the amount and number of people that we have in this region. But if you will see properly at what we have on the table, you'll also see quite a few countries that were not able to actually specify their needs in terms of what they require for both adaptation and mitigation within the agriculture sector. And this is something that we need to improve and provide capacity to countries, and countries themselves also need to make the effort to clearly cost what is needed for the agriculture sector. Because this is what is actually going to support different financiers in being able to target how much money they need to really allocate to the sector. And this is something that we saw in a few countries, but we're only looking at these two regions. You can imagine that when we look at at developing countries as a whole, when we look at the Standing Committee on Finance report on climate finance, looking at the needs, this is a trend that was seen in a lot of countries. That agriculture sector, but in general, needs were not well costed across the NDCs. But from what we see, there has been, of course, some climate finance flowing into the region, highlighting Ethiopia, which has been able to access quite a large amount of climate finance. But this, of course, does not mean that all its needs have been met, as we saw from the previous slide. And it is important that we try to improve and increase access across the region. But there has been quite some climate finance flowing into the Sahel and Horn of Africa. But I'll also ask you to look at certain countries that are currently in a fragile situation. When we look at the amount of climate finance that has gone to Somalia, the amount of climate finance that has gone to South Sudan, we see that they have been receiving a very low share of the climate finance that has been flowing through the region, yet they are the regions that are at higher risk, especially due to the compounding nature which conflict brings in terms of complexity to actually being able to allow for vulnerable communities to adapt to climate change. So it is important that we also think around how we can actually help these vulnerable countries to better access climate finance. When we look at the countries, so I mean, I'm not able to zoom, unfortunately. Sincere apologies. But yes, here we have we have the countries around the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. The first three bars here, we're looking at Ethiopia, Kenya, and Nigeria, where Nigeria was able to access between 2010, and I should have maybe added that, between 2010 and 2022, was able to access about 2.7 trillion. Nigeria billion. Nigeria about 3 billion, Kenya around $4 billion, and Ethiopia above $6 billion between 2010 and 2022. And on the lower end, we have Eritrea, Djibouti, Mauritania, and Somalia, who were able to access much less than 300 million over this period between 2010 and 2022. So thank you for highlighting that, and I hope that that has helped to clarify, of course, some of the data that was being shown. Then on this graph, we have now to which sectors the climate finance has been flowing. Looking at adaptation, mitigation, but also dual benefits, or what we call the co-benefits of adaptation projects with mitigation co-benefits in the region. And thankfully, we can say that at least for the agriculture sector, forestry and land use, majority of the climate finance, and as is the priority for the continent, has been going to adaptation. So this is definitely something that needs to continue to be emphasized, especially, as I mentioned, the vulnerability within this sector, and for those people who actually depend on this sector is quite high. And we definitely need to continue providing finance for adaptation. The same, and I would say similar levels as has been. Mitigation is, of course, still important, but for the continent to guarantee that there is poverty reduction and sustainable development, adaptation is critical and important. When we look at the overall levels of climate finance over the last few years, of course, as we all know, the climate finance has been increasing. In 2022, developed countries were able to reach and pass the 100 billion target that they've had of providing their annual climate finance to developing countries. But the same rise that we do see in the overall climate finance is accompanied by a similar rise in loans. And as we know, and as I mentioned, of course, most of the finance has been going to adaptation. When you look at the proportions that we saw previously in terms of what is going in terms of finance to adaptation, and we see that today much more closer to half, as we're getting, as has been increasing, we are seeing a considerable amount of loans coming in to also finance adaptation. So this is definitely something that we need to think about in terms of the long-term sustainability in providing loans for a sector that is actually supporting the most vulnerable. But when we look also in terms of the finance and the population or the workforce in the agriculture sector, we do see that there's also been an increase in the dollar per capita for the agriculture workforce from about, I think it was around $2 per agricultural per person in the agricultural workforce, and that has risen to about $16 over the last year, which I would say is a great improvement in terms of the level of finance when we look at the per capita flows of this. But we do need to reflect a bit deeper on this. Some of these projects that are registered on an annual basis actually have 3 to 5 year time frames. So you would look at this in the sense of how much would a farmer be getting on average per year or per agricultural season, where in some countries some farmers actually have 2 agricultural seasons. And you sort of start to see that although there has been significant improvement, there is definitely still a lot of space for this to improve. I will ask a question for you to reflect on as you think about in your own countries. For example, how much does a 1 kilogram bag of seeds cost, right? And you'll see that technically speaking, what we're saying is that a farmer would only be getting like a bag of seeds or maybe 2 bags of seeds per agricultural season. To on average, as we know in our continent, a farmer farms about on average about an hectare, which of course those seeds would probably not be sufficient, especially if we keep saying that we want for farmers to access, for example, drought-tolerant seeds, new varieties. It definitely is a little bit challenging to on the ground actually be able to allow them to have that kind of capacity. When we look at these projects, we also did try to understand how much is actually going, how much these projects are also focusing on gender. In our continent, most of our smallholder farmers and farmers in general are women. And we do believe that there also needs to be climate finance projects that do have a particular and principal focus also on gender. But at the moment, if you look at the graph in green, you will see that at the moment, projects with a principal focus on gender are only about 5%, with another 40 having gender as significant. Of course, this might happen due to the fact that most projects do try to guarantee at least a good level of gender balance, but most climate finance projects need to begin shifting into transformative adaptation with a gender focus. And that is going to be very critical, because if we look at, for example, the kind of challenges that women face in the rural areas, especially with climate change, right? If you look at, for example, the kind of work on a day-to-day that a woman has to do, for example, to collect water, they do need to walk for long distances. But with climate change, they're having to walk longer distances, meaning that even the time that they have to be able to practice agriculture is reducing due to the challenges of climate change. So making sure that we're being able to address problems as such as well is important to guarantee that that resilience is being built, especially for women. So this is some of the information and data that we were able to look at in this study, and some of the insights and reflections that we've had having looked at the study itself, with some recommendations for negotiations as we go into discussions around the new collective goal on climate finance. The first thing, and I think this will come from experience from a lot of us in the room, is that there definitely needs to be improvements in access. processes to access climate finance, especially when we're looking at the financial mechanisms of the UNFCCC, are extremely bureaucratic and they're not streamlined and standardized. And this definitely creates a burden of capacity for developing countries to be able to access finance. There are many different methodologies across to proposal development. There's definitely a lot of gaps when we look at technology, information systems to be able to actually provide climate justification for investments. And these are some of the different difficulties that countries have faced and that they need support in. As I had mentioned initially, we definitely need to make a push also from the developing country side, supporting developing countries to better cost their needs in the sector. The better costing will definitely equate to much clearer financial targets that countries will need to prioritize within their national strategies, but also for developed countries to actually be able to allocate resources with more transparency as well. Again, the agriculture and the forestry sector are critical to livelihoods, and definitely we need to make sure that we continue to create conditions for increased grant allocation to this sector versus loans. Conditions definitely need to be created for this, and hopefully the NCQG can set signals that will allow for more grant-based funding to flow to the region and to the sector. There needs to be, of course, also when we're looking at the financial mechanisms, a more transparent allocation in terms of the funding to countries. And this is something that we saw a challenge with when we were looking in terms of trying to track what's happening within regional projects. If you see and you ask different countries, there's this aversion now to regional projects, although a lot of the climate risks are becoming transboundary. But this also has to do a lot with the lack of transparency, because it's very difficult for you to specifically track when a project is regional how much has actually gone to each of the countries. And this is also something that needs to be improved. And then, of course, making sure, most importantly, that the climate finance is reaching local communities and is reaching more smallholder farmers. One thing that I did not mention when I was talking about the per capita point is that from those projects we would also need to deduct, for example, the investment at national level, right? There are national level capacities that are being built. Of course, those do have benefits to the local level, but we also want to make sure that there is a sufficient amount reaching smallholder farmers themselves. And to finalize, as I mentioned, a lot of the countries in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa do have a compounding effect on their food security coming from both climate and conflict. And these countries at the moment are not receiving sufficient climate finance. So some effort does need to be made to make sure that these countries are also being able to access additional climate finance. And with that, I bring my presentation to a close. I hope that that was informative, and thank you very much, and hope that we have a great discussion moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I think that was quite profound in terms of highlighting the critical issues that require our collective attention, but also looking at what is coming up. I was quite impressed, particularly when you begin to point to the challenge around access, when you begin to point to the challenge around transparency, which is extremely critical, but also when you begin to connect back in terms of the debt, the growing debt. I think your graph was quite clear in terms of the growing debt portfolio that is, again, associated with the agriculture sector in your presentation, and I think that was quite useful in this particular regard. And this connects quite well with the work that PACHA is doing, and PACHA convened last year the Conference on Accelerating Agricultural Adaptation in Africa in Nigeria. Some of the recommendations that you've also provided are actually espoused in the statement that we released that particular time. I'm not meant to unpack this data. There is a team of experts that is actually going to unpack this data, and I want to call to the fore the following persons. Tom Skiro, who is sitting next to me, just assume one of the seats at your convenience. Tom comes from Tree Aid. In fact, he's the CEO of Tree Aid, just to make it more clearer. And then we have Andefaya Wokfu. I believe I've pronounced the name correctly, who is the national coordinator and focal person for Green Legacy Initiative and the Pan-African Great Wall. Kindly take the seat to the fore. And then we have Peter Bentley, who is the team lead, adaptation and resilience, FCDO UK. He's already there. Peter would propose you come this side. Then, so that I'm not killed, we also have Mother Bekele. Mother Bekele is a co-founder, co-director, founder and co-director, financing at development transition. She takes the center stage. In our culture, we protect women. They must be at the center. We want to move to a very interesting conversation, and the conversation will focus more on the data. What is that data telling us? When you look at what has been presented, what is it telling us? And what are we not doing right? And how best can this be corrected? I think this would be quite useful as a conversational area, looking at that data. What is it telling us? What are we not doing right? And how best can it be corrected, again, to ensure that we leapfrog agriculture financing in Africa to the next level. I want to start in an orthodox manner. I want to start to the extreme right. And the mic is yours. You've got like 3-4 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice to see everyone here. Yeah, I mean, TRIAID's been working for about 37 years in climate adaptation and mitigation across the Sahel. So we've seen a lot of change and a lot of difficulty in terms of the climate adaptation challenges for communities in that space. And I think really, I don't want to kind of repeat everything that Pedro said, but it's amazing how much this report has demonstrated what we feel on the ground when we're talking to governments and communities who are experiencing the climate crisis right now. There is clearly a major challenge of there just simply not being enough climate finance. And I think we all recognize that, even on Finance Day. We know there are challenges in that space, but we have to keep reiterating that there is not enough finance available for communities right now. Secondly, I think that a major challenge is just the capacity of country governments to be able to get through these processes. So the table up there about NDC needs and the way that different countries have different levels of need is entirely based on the capacity of those countries' ability to fully understand the system, fully understand how to process that and understand their own data in order to present in the right way to a very international system. And there hasn't been enough effort to capacity build those countries to be able to do that in the most effective way. I mean, one of my favorite stats up there was that was $0.378 billion required in Burkina Faso. When I sat there and was trying to work that out, 0.0378 was like $37 million for mitigation by 2030. That's peanuts in a country like Burkina Faso. Obviously, they need a lot more, but it's rushed deadlines, it's not understanding the processes, so it's putting in a number. So there's clearly a lot of inaccuracy that completely understates the needs that are out there right now. So let's be clear, there's not enough finance, and there's certainly not even enough for what we're saying the needs are right now. On top of that, we have this problem of debt increasing. So we see this, particularly in Mali and in Ethiopia, actually, that debt is increasing specifically as a portion of climate finance. And as Pedro eloquently put it, these are maybe the most subprime of subprime loans. These are smallholder farmers at the front line of the climate crisis. These are not great bets to be putting large amounts of debt finance into. And so we really have to think about other ways that we can deal with that, whether that's through debt for nature swaps or more public grant financing. We really need to think about in the most difficult circumstances how we deal with that in the most appropriate way. I would also say that even if the finance is available, it's incredibly difficult to access that financing for a lot of these country offices. The complexity, the time, the processes, it's unfathomable, even to someone like TRIAID, right? We can't even advise these governments sometimes on how complex this system is. because it's so opaque, it's so difficult. So I think that we really have to just really knuckle down on the idea of leveling the playing field in terms of education and knowledge, and how that everyone can access this is through everyone having the equal information and the equal knowledge to participate. I think the other aspect that really came out from Pedro's presentation and from the paper overall is around that conflict sensitivity. And I think what you're finding is that, much like the private market, the public market moves to where the safest places are. Where is the safe place to put their money? And anywhere that is insecure or unstable, or where we're not entirely sure of the good intentions of that government in the long term from a Western perspective, you end up in a situation where the money just doesn't flow in that direction. And I think really we have to think, where is the money most required to save communities who are on the front line of the climate crisis? Let's not be unfair to those countries that are already suffering not only from climate crisis but from conflict affected areas, and we have to think, how do we push money into the hard places, not just into the easy places? I think I'll stop there and let somebody else have a go.
Thank you so much. I just want to move the mic quickly to people who are interacting directly with communities to get some quick perspectives on what the realities are on the ground. Over to you.
Thank you very much for having me here. My name is Adefres. I came from Ethiopia. I'm the focal person for the Great Green Wall Africa, and also I am coordinating this Green Legacy Initiative of Ethiopia. And Green Legacy Initiative of Ethiopia is a flagship program, nature-based solution, actually aiming at restoring 22 million hectares of land. This is what Ethiopia has pledged to the Bonn Challenge, the New York Declaration, and also to the AFR 100. So we have been planting seedlings, restoring ecosystems and ecosystem services through tree planting. And also with this initiative, we wanted to sustainably manage those biodiversity and the carbon-rich forests, which are the only remnant forests in the country, because conserving those ecosystems, those forests, is not only important for Ethiopia, but also to the downstream sister countries, because the majority of those transboundary rivers of Ethiopia, including Nile, and also those crossing to Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, Kenya, my friend, to Turkana, are emanating in those highland forests. So losing those forests means losing that amount of water, which is also crossing to the sister countries. So coming back to what these figures tells, honestly speaking, even I never thought that this is the amount of per capita that our farmers have been getting. Like if you see the figure, it looks big. Like Ethiopia has mobilized 600 million USD, between these, 10 years. And you can imagine our farmers have been doing agriculture every year. And this is the amount of resource that we are able to mobilize. It looks big, but you divide by those farmers, these millions of farmers in the Horn of Africa, and this is going to be a very small amount of money. And I was like, I was asking myself, what do you do? And should I come even to COP, honestly speaking? Should I spend, 10 days or 2 weeks, in every COP, like honestly speaking, to talk about climate change, to talk about climate finance, so on and so forth? Okay, we don't have option. We have to continue that one, but it's an amazing one. $60, which cannot buy, a small kilo of fertilizer or improved seed for a farmer. That is, that is the truth on the ground. Amazingly, we cannot also stop agriculture, because like you come to Ethiopia, 90% of our communities are smallholder farmers. And the majority of them, again, close to 60 million, 16 million are pastoral communities. These are the ones who are very much, exposed to not, bigger drought, but a small one. If a 1 week rain, in a 1 week rain delay will devastate, those households, honestly speaking, when it comes and when it leaves during the rainy season. So, what these figures tells me is that we, as a nation, as a country, really need to dedicate the amount of money that we have in our treasury, to do something, while also, negotiating with those guys who have a better capacity, better technology, and also a better resource. But imagine Ethiopia when we prepare this climate resilient green growth strategy, which is communicated to the global community at COP11 Dubai. We say that Ethiopia need about $150 billion by 2030 to be a resilient country, to be a country with carbon neutral. And out of that 150 billion plan, Ethiopia has mobilized 600 million USD, and that is the largest one. You can imagine with all the countries. Some of the countries are even more vulnerable than us. Take Somalia, who are more drier than even Ethiopia, who have less rain, less rivers, less amount of water. So you can imagine that as we talk this, you can see that more youth have been dropping their ancestral activities, pastoralism, dropping agriculture. So that where are these youth going? They have to cross the Sahara Desert or the Indian Ocean. The majority of them in this desert or in this ocean. So I think what this figure tells me is a lot of morality issue. I mean, the developed countries who has caused the climate to change need to really think of this discussion seriously and then start to walk the talk and do something, a meaningful support to some of those countries. But also, again, I have been taking a lot of lessons from this, that we, as a nation, for instance, the government of Ethiopia has also need to mobilize a significant amount of resource, which is focused building the resilience of smallholder farmers. In fact, very recently, my Prime Minister convinced his cabinet to mobilize a special grant for landscape restoration, for instance, because restoration is going to be a lot for agriculture, building the resilience of smallholder farmers, ecosystems, and also pastoral communities. That we approved, the cabinet approved to mobilize about 1% of the annual budget of the country specifically for ecosystem restoration. That means that this is going to be, done as an agroforestry, as soil and water conservation, input supply to the farmers, and so on and so forth. And that is really going to be, a little bit drop in this effort, while also we discuss, on this type of forums. And then, the home tech message that I see that our discussion needs to really be, convincing, so that the finance will come, so that those who have the capacity to share technology and the finance need to really support us, particularly those in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other parts of the continent. And but we need to really put a lot of pressure on ourselves, on our private companies, on our good, well-to-do guys to mobilize more resource from our own, and then implement good practices and also show to the global community to mobilize resources to scale up those best resources. And this is what really those figures telling me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, my brother. I think that's quite profound, compounded with, again, local actions that are actually being led by government of Ethiopia. I think that is more than appreciated. I only fear that you started nearly making it an act of charity, yet it ought to be mandatory, again, for developed countries to make those contributions and those funds to flow at speed and scale to match the needs of developing countries. I want to come to a controversial lady, but this time I have told her to be modest in her controversy because she's been looking at data. Initially, she was looking at data innocently, but she started to politicize the data. Mother, what does those figures tell us? Are there gaps in analysis?
If you, I'm not capable of being modest. Otherwise, you wouldn't have invited me. You want me to be politically incorrect. Since Ethiopia has been mentioned, let me start from Ethiopia. Pedro, in your presentation, you had presented Ethiopia as the biggest receiver here. The latest data from OECD DAC shows us that Ethiopia was actually, yes, you are right, 18.01% of grants that came for adaptation went to Ethiopia. However, when I was presenting this during the CCDA 12, the 12th session in Abidjan last month, or a couple of months ago, the Ethiopian government, the minister, actually said that is not correct. What had happened, that is 2022, yeah? What had happened was that our country had just come out of war, 2 years war. And whatever money was coming for recovery was recorded as climate adaptation, okay? So you need to really interrogate, because when you are tracking data, tracking finances, you look at the key search words. You have key search words, and those are gotten from the project description. So the data here is putting adaptation there, and you are believing that. And that is exactly what is happening. But I'll give you another example from Kenya, for instance. There is an EU project, there is a grant to Kenya, about 6.6 million in 2022 for ending drought emergencies, climate-proofed infrastructure for improved WASH program. Yeah? But there is no indication that there was additionality on that. It was repurposing of ODA grant to adaptation. That is one. Another example from Japan, and as you may know, Japan is notorious in reporting inflated climate finances. We have evidence, there is literature out there. So one of the projects that Japan was supporting was called container terminal construction, again in Kenya. And this is these projects are provided. They provided 216 million as ODA loans between 2018 and 22, and tagged as adaptation. I will repeat the title of the project. It is called Container Terminal Construction. Okay, so I wanted us just to say, for us, when we are tracking, we are looking at project description, and we're picking key search words, but we're not going all the way to look at impact. And remember, this is self-reporting. Yeah. I also wanted to touch on the date issue. The date issue. And I have started calling this borrowing from the arsonist. Someone has put fire, has lit your house, and then they are giving you money to build back and prevent future fire, but you have to pay back. That's exactly what is happening. Why? Because number one, there is this perceived risk, lending to African countries. Perceived risk, meaning that you have like S&P, Moody's, Fitch, and what? Yeah, the credit ratings agencies. There are about 4 in the world. The biggest are 3. They don't have staff here, or they don't have enough staff here. So what happens is that they look at Ethiopia, and Ethiopia has just come out of war, and they say, no, this is, like what they're doing is what Trump told us, shithole countries. So why would you bother doing enough assessment about these countries? So that puts the cost of borrowing so much higher. We are borrowing 8 times more, that is the interest rate. And Mo Ibrahim had called this mafia type interest rate. What we are facing in Africa is mafia type of interest and mafia type interest. We are borrowing to do climate action, which we had minimal contribution, if any. That is the point. There is also that misconception, let me just mention it while we are here, is that we have borrowed a lot in Africa. We have not. Okay, so there is also that misconception, because it is also pushing our rating down to junk and what, Our average debt to GDP is 64% in Africa, okay? Compare that to Japan, which is 266%, okay? What else? You mentioned about gender. There is a study we did for Rwanda, and if I can just quickly pull out the data for you, we noticed that So in Rwanda, for instance, you will note that gender responsive climate finance made up only 3.3%. But anyway, at the end, what we found is that just $1 in 1,000 was going for those that are gender responsive, but climate action. And then if you look at what has come to Africa in 2022, if you look at climate principle, gender principle, gender objectives that are designed for the objective of carrying out climate action, that's what we call principle, and you look at gender principle again, you'll find that what came to Africa was 69.64 was reported as climate principle. Of that, the gender element, any that has gender element was 1.35%. Include more intersectionality like disability, so that you have climate, gender, disability, principal objectives, you will find 0.01%. So that also shows you then how neglected intersection is. At the end of the day, I mean, my brother here was saying he was contemplating not coming here. What is the point? This is the 29th year that we are negotiating. We are begging because it has become like charity, as you said, but there is no charity. In 1965, Kwame Nkrumah had already told us, this is neocolonialism. I apologize. This is neocolonialism, And he called it neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, There is no charity. There is something they are benefiting. The global north, we need to go back to the basics. In the convention, we have polluters pay. This is not charity. Someone has come to burn the house and they need to build it back. So maybe what I urge, and I've been saying this since I came here, is that maybe it's time. Argentina pulled out its negotiators yesterday. They don't see any use. On the other hand, we don't have Papua New Guinea because they have lost hope. Mr. Trump, we know what is going to happen from January 2025. He's already told us that he is going to pull away. Hence, are we going to come back COP30 to discuss the same thing, to beg for money? Or will we start thinking radically, taking radical positions, and also making radical moves? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mother. I think it's difficult to stop a lady from speaking. But again, you can be sure the man next to you, Peter, is actually converted. He speaks your language, so you don't need to apologize too much. We are in a conversation of global transformation. I think that's useful. I think what is coming from Mother is that we must look at data with a tooth comb and delve deeper to look at it. Peter, I want to stretch you a bit in your response. Looking at the data, looking at what is coming out, looking at the challenges, how is the North positioning itself within such a context? Thanks.
Thank you. Slightly tough gig to follow after three positions, then coming in as the donor. It's always nice to come in at the end. And so following that particular intervention, I'm going to be careful about ringing the bell too hard for the wonders of the UK. But just as my position as the UK Foreign Officer, I will just, how seriously we're taking this domestically. So we launched our new NDC. And then kind of from an agriculture point of view, as a third of greenhouse gases, we're really looking at that kind of industry and thinking about what can we do in this space around subsidies, investments, and looking at a long-term view on our own sustainable agriculture and things. And also reaffirming our 11.6 billion commitment to international climate finance. So our new government, and although there are other governments that may, going forwards, be changing their position, so we are very much here to stay on this stage, and we hope that as the process goes forwards, we can play a really positive key role to that. Our Prime Minister was here, and he said the same. But hopefully, all that does is bring us to the table. That's not fishing for applause. That's just to say we're here. From a kind of access to climate finance perspective, like this is a huge challenge, and we have this. I was in Chad last week, and they said, "Oh, it's wonderful you signed the COP28 declaration on more for fragile states, particularly thinking around kind of sustainable agriculture and food and things." We haven't seen any money yet, so and we can't eat that declaration. So there's a real kind of point about how can more fragile states and many developing countries struggle with capacity, but particularly more fragile ones. But we're to focus on them particularly, and around applying for this money. You know, for them to put enough resources into apply and get this money, the risk is they don't get it, and they have to move huge resources to getting this. And we really acknowledge that, and you know, pushing as our co-chairing of the GCF for more readiness funds, more capacity support to give out the funds. And there are checks and balances, and there are always going to be checks and balances within donor money, but we do need to look at how they're kind of a pragmatic levels of checks and balances, but also around what we're funding, what we're kind of working with countries to fund, and asking the countries, you know, at a local level, because we're really thinking about locally led adaptation as well, what is the most practical thing that can happen, and the most effective way, and then pushing and incentivizing, as us as donors, the big funds to make sure they're supporting those interventions. And also we're kind of thinking, we're getting much better, not perfect, at thinking in the long kind of term. Again, I'm talk about Chad just because I've just been there, but kind of the refugee crisis. And then now we're working with WFP on much more resilient, longer term kind of food production, looking at land tenure and things. And this is, WFP are saying they're doing this, you know, all over the place. And it's working with local communities, renting land from local farm owners. So that helps kind of moving the economy there, but also then looking at kind of technology, using that data about what works and doesn't. I mean, WFP was saying there's 40% food wastage in some of the farms that they were looking at and working with, you know, and that's a terrifying statistic. And so not only is that money flowing, so it's small amounts of money flowing, and then if you're having 40% wastage within this, again, I'm not saying that's universal, but you know, how can we make sure we're sharing technology, sharing that kind of knowledge? Because it's not just about the money. You know, we've put $2 billion into the GCF. There's a fair amount of money, and often it's not the amount of money, it's how quickly it comes, how long it's committed for. You know, sometimes, you know, as you said, kind of split over the whole of Ethiopia. But the problem is if that comes in one tranche, you have a small amount of money, you run a short project, then khalas, it's finished. And so we kind of want to look at kind of longer term, more sustainable funding, kind of so you can reliably hire people, you can build that technology and have that kind of sustainability. And that's certainly our ambition. And within the NCQG, looking at kind of, you know, we really want there to be a proper, as the UK, to be a proper strong offer for LDCs and for the more vulnerable countries and for the SIDS as well. And then within the global goal and adaptation, so, you know, within the 7 sectors, there's food and the biodiversity and water, so most relevant here. And I think like looking at how those indicators, we're not in favour of kind of big input targets around those on financial stage. What we want to see is indicators that incentivise action, that look at things like harmful subsidies, because time and again we're seeing these subsidies that are set up. We have this in the UK where actually subsidies that were set up with all the best intentions are not actually incentivizing more sustainable use and things. And so actually helping countries around those subsidies, around what are our grants doing that actually, you know, if you're trucking in food for humanitarian crisis, is that actually disrupting natural local supply chains and things? Anyway, at the risk of being accused as a man who won't stop talking, perhaps I'll give back and let you come. Anyway, I don't think that's, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think that's quite useful in terms of putting us in context of what you are doing, how you are doing it. Again, I know we put funds in multilateral systems. Again, those funds are not accessible, but we are also part of enacting those constraining structures around access within the multilateral system. So we need to keep reflecting on what that means, even as we put resources in that particular space. I wanted to improvise this panel because I'm supposed to transit to the next panel, but before I transit to the next panel, let me just provide a quick overview of what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that there is a financing gap, and the financing gap needs to be closed quite fast. There are financing instruments. A majority are not working, particularly when it comes to loans. The question of access remains central to all the conversation, and we need to think how we connect nature and agriculture for purposes of ensuring that our farming practices are sustainable. And the question of per capita investments remains at the center of it. And there are elements of misreporting on climate data, additionality elements and repurposing of, again, financing is sitting at the center of all the fraud. But we need to think broadly around the sustainability elements, which are quite critical in this particular case. With your permission, we are supposed to transit to the next panel. I was supposed to drop 2 people, but I will not drop anyone. I will add a seat to the floor. Apologies. I'll just add 1 more seat to the floor and invite Dr. Mithika Mwenda, because he was the only missing panelist, to join the second session. Dr. Mithika, the space is yours, unless you've donated the power. Then I look for Charles Mwangi. Charles Mwangi, if you are not there. Charles Mwangi, you are there? Yes, Charles Mwangi is right in the front. I know he donates power, so apologies. Good. The reason is why I'm trying to expand this panel is so that we have a much more deeper conversation. And the conversation is now connecting all those challenges, what you've heard, the summary of what I've presented, with the conversation within the negotiation rooms, what they mean, what is coming out, and whether there is hope for agriculture. If we are going to secure gains for agriculture, what is that we need to do differently while we are here in Baku, particularly linked to 2 elements which are important: the global goal on adaptation, which is actually anchoring the agriculture conversation, but more usefully, the new collective quantified goal, ensuring that the aspirations that we have for overcoming those challenges are well addressed. So I want first to look at somebody who has been inside the negotiation rooms, and I'll start with my brother and the fires, actually basically to hear quickly what is evolving within the negotiation rooms and what we need to watch through. Thanks. And then I can pass it quickly to Mother, because Mother has some quick insights, and then I'll bring in my brother, Charles Mwangi, again to make a contribution. Over to you and the fires.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this is what I wanted to say. You know, while we are negotiating for technology transfer, for climate finance, for partnership, for building capacity, so on and so forth, what we need to do immediately is, to reconnect, for instance, agriculture with sustainable natural resource management. This is really where I wanted to underline. I mean, as it is already said, the rest of the thing are going to be a process anyways. Like, okay, my sister mentioned that, okay, there is a possibility to go out, to leave the room. But I don't think that is going to be, a solution anyway. So I think it is better to stay in the room and then to push, maybe, to do it differently than the way now we are doing it. Our government needs to engage more bilaterally and multilaterally to push and convince those who polluted, the world, to immediately engage in the pay. That is one thing. But as we do this, I wanted to reiterate that agriculture in Africa, in particular, should not be done in the expense of natural resource, management. For instance, in Ethiopia, there was this data which says that Ethiopia has been losing 92,000 hectares of its forest annually between 2000 and 2012. This is a 10 years data and studied by FAO. And 92,000 hectares of very biodiversity and carbon-rich forests, which are also going to be very important for the agriculture, for the energy, for the water sector, were replaced by unsustainable agricultural practices. So now the government has been saying that, okay, agriculture and the natural resource management should not be seen as 2 different sectors, and should not be an enemy to each other. And then we need to really work on the interface so that agriculture consider the sustainability of natural resource, and natural resource management should also need to contribute for the fast growing and the resilience of the agriculture or food production system. So where we can immediately start to impact our food system is to, bring a peace between the agriculture and the natural resource management in each of our country. So that is really going to give us, the privilege to work in the interface of agriculture, water, forest, and generally land. So as we do this, then we can also continue with, the remaining of, the processes, because they are a process. For instance, if you mention me, I don't know, this is not impolite to mention. For instance, we applied to JEF for this LDCF program, and then we got, this PPG fund. And then that fund, this is 200,000 for 10 million, to prepare a 10 million project. And then they say that, okay, now you can submit your program in 18 months. And $200,000, 18 months. I have to go back to them with my full-fledged project after 18 months. And I mean, this is very practical one. Why not they allow us to submit in 2 months, in 3 months, as far as we have the capacity to prepare. We can engage, organization from abroad who can support us. The CGIAR there, for instance, if you come to Ilri, we have many of them and many scientists sitting there to support the government. And then this project could have been developed in 6 months, at least in 7-8 months. But you have to wait, for this very lengthy process. I think that needs to be, reconsidered, not by JEF, GCF, and the CIF necessarily, but also by the donor countries who donate their support to those companies, so that they will shorten accessing that resource. That is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Probably before you hand over the mic, is it possible to hear what is coming from the negotiation room in one word? No worries, I'll manage. Mother, I'll constrain you a bit in 2 minutes. Do we have hope for new collective quantified goal and the global goal on adaptation in reference to agriculture?
Thank you, Philip. Just to correct a minor but major gross misunderstanding, I did not say that we pull out. In any case, Africa is better off in a multilateral process under the UN. That's what we're pushing. But my worry is, especially if negotiations are going to go ahead on bilateral terms and MDBs are hugely involved, then we may have the fate of the WTO, which got stuck after the Doha round in 2001. Yeah. Coming back to NCQG, that's what I'm following, and I'll stick my comment on that. No, I don't see any hope, because what I heard in the room is that developed countries have not even put any amount on the table, whereas developing countries have put a quantum on it. Developed countries are insisting that this is supposed to be a global effort, meaning that we need to broaden the contributor base. The push for the private sector, that is a major divider in a major divide in the room. Because we want to confine such negotiations, such talks, to public resources and possibly to grant-based. We are here since 1871, if I'm not mistaken, because of capitalism. So, creating another opportunity for making money is unacceptable, at least in the eyes of developing countries. Investments is what is being pushed by developed countries, whereas developing countries are saying that this needs to be dedicated domestic resources mobilization from global north that should flow to global south. I don't know how that can be bridged. The other major divide that I saw in the room is that developed countries are pushing that loss and damage be dropped from the framework of the NCQG, which developing countries are not accepting so far. So these are major divides, and I don't see anything coming out of it, to be honest with you, but I'm cynical, you know me.
Thank you so much. I want to pass this mic to Charles Mwangi, who is the head of program and research, Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And you've been listening a lot to the panelists, but you are also listening to the negotiation rooms. Do we have hopes? And where should we premise the hope? Thanks.
So thank you so much, Philip. We must keep hope alive. And the last thing we're supposed to lose is actually hope. But I want to say this. If there's one thing that this COP should actually safeguard, it is the right to food. We probably can survive without anything else. Maybe we can survive without energy, without transport systems, but we cannot survive without food. But then agriculture is also the most sensitive sector to climate change. If you look at the context of Africa, which actually accounts for 65% of the total global uncultivated arable land, 95% of our agriculture is actually rain-fed. But we've been experiencing erratic rainfall patterns for a long time now. And therefore, we cannot guarantee, food safety, food sovereignty. We can't feed ourselves, even though we are actually supposed to be the food basket, for the world. And therefore, we must ask ourselves, what is ailing the agricultural sector, particularly in the continent? Now, if you look at the average age of a farmer in Africa, the reality of the matter is the average age is actually 60 years. Although there's data that is proposing that probably that figure has gone down to about 40 or thereabout, but the reality of the matter is an average farmer is an old man or an old woman, and that is why in our magazines, agriculture magazines, you always see a picture of an old woman or an old man, projected there, with his corn and fruits and so on and so forth. And this sector is not attractive even to the young people. Yet this is a sector that really holds the future of the globe. Now, having said that, we must then ask ourselves, when it comes now to flooding resilience, particularly for the continent, where should we focus most? And to me, I think agriculture needs to be the main area that we need to focus on. Whether we are talking about adaptation, whether we are talking about the new, collective quantified, finance goal, agriculture really should be at the center. And I think we need to look at the various, should I say, value chain, stages, for the entire food, system. Look at production. Yesterday I was watching TV back home, and I saw a farmer who produced so much of tomatoes, but he could only feed animals. He could not get adequate transport system to the market. So there's a whole question of production. And how are we cushioning, our farmers in terms of how they're producing and ensuring they produce quality that can compete in the market. But there's also the entire, issue of transportation, which sometimes we do ignore. Are our farmers able to reach the market? How are our transport systems? Are they resilient? Are we attracting resources to build resilient transport systems to ensure that our farmers can actually be able to, access the market? Sometimes I think about Africa and I compare it with Europe. How comes we've never had a proper railway transport that connects Ghana, to Kenya, for example, so that we can enjoy cocoa from Ghana, cheaply, and that we can transport our cabbage from Kenya again, to Southern Sudan and so on and so forth. We must think about this infrastructure as part of what we need to build, resilience. We must also look at the whole question of, marketing. And there is a whole question of imbalance in trade again, which is a critical factor that we don't sometimes consider in some of these, conversations. And now we are getting to see ourselves being boxed to looking at agriculture from a mitigation point of view. And that is one thing, as Africa Group of Negotiators have been, fighting against. We cannot sit and start talking about the pastoral communities, and we are talking about how they can reduce their livestock because their livestock are producing methane. We have to look at agriculture from adaptation point of view. Cushion, producers, build infrastructure, transport infrastructure that is important, that can be able to help them reach the market. But also most importantly, reduce the post-harvest losses. 30% of what we produce is lost. Why? Because we don't have cooling systems. And cooling systems are actually a factor of energy. Energy is not available in Africa. 630 million have got no access to energy. Again, looking at energy not as a mitigation issue, but as an adaptation issue. And all these are what we are saying that needs to be funded, through what we are negotiating. The quantum that Africa Group of Negotiators have settled for, $1.3 trillion at the very minimum. Remember, to implement the NDCs in the entire continent of Africa, we actually need $3 trillion. I can bet there's nothing that has come through, towards that particular end. And I'm saying, so even the 1.3 quantum that we're calling for is far shorter than what Africa actually needs to implement just the NDCs. And that is Africa alone. And I want to say this, and I want to talk about what my sister has just mentioned and the nuances within the negotiation rooms. Well, Africa is pushing for this 1.3 to come from public sources and from the developed country parties. The reality of the matter is we are now being boxed into moving towards private sector investment, and I dare say, you cannot just, privatize adaptation. Where we need to encourage investments, private sector investment in adaptation, but we must see significant investment from public, sources. The other thing that we're also hearing is that we are being told to actually resource or actually mobilize resources from domestic sources, to contribute to this 1.3. And I dare say, the African governments are actually spending 5 to 15% of what they collect to actually finance adaptation, knowingly or otherwise. Because climate change doesn't give you an option. You just have to adapt. Adaptation is something that you naturally, and spontaneously have to do. And therefore, sometimes even without necessarily accounting for it, you end up spending so much, in terms of really building resilience of our people, whether it is targeted, or not. And therefore, the African governments are already spending too much on that. And coming to the issue of loans, I think on average, countries are spending 65% of their, total collections, to actually pay debts. So many countries are actually staring, at sinking in serious debts. And therefore, climate finance cannot again be availed in form of loans, notwithstanding concessional loans or the other, commercial loans. So you must really be very, very, serious about how then we're approaching this particular issue. Let money come from the public, sources. And I dare say, this year alone, there is one country in the world that was able to actually, in one sitting, approve 95 billion US dollars, 95 billion US dollars to go for war in Israel, in Taiwan, in Ukraine. One country. The Congress said once, the Senate said once, and they were able to approve that. But we cannot even afford 1 billion, for loss and damage. We still have not even achieved that 1 billion for loss and damage. So what are we saying? There is plenty of resources in the globe, but I think our priorities are inverted. And food should take precedence. Food should actually be prioritized. Food should be prioritized before war. Food should be prioritized before any other conversation. And therefore, the 1.3 that we are talking about, we are pushing that it must come through public sources, because we're already spending ourselves, from our exchequer in terms of financing adaptation in various ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. I think you painted quite a complex picture in terms of the challenges themselves, Africa needing resources to adapt, but it's also investing a lot to adapt. It's experiencing losses and damages, which require to be addressed, but it's also heavily on loans. That's quite a stark context. And looking at the 1.3 trillion, which African countries are demanding, I'll come back to Peter in 2 minutes. What is the perspective on the North? And are we getting this one? What is the perspective on the North around the demands from developing countries? And are we getting this figure? Is it going to be aligned well to the adaptation agenda? That is what I just want to hear quickly from you, and then we can open it for questions.
Big questions and very challenging answers. My role is on adaptation and resilience. So this is what I spend all my time worrying about and thinking about. And I have the adaptation negotiators within my team, and we're acutely aware. The recent adaptation gap report. The needs are absolutely vast, right? And we do think there is a huge role. A need around the public finance. I think it's kind of where the challenges are coming from around the accessing to it and the quantum as well. There's no clear answer. I don't want to get into the kind of war versus food. As a human being, I think I obviously know which one the priority is. Politically, and even if you look at the world leaders who have been here, like the domestic kind of agendas and things. Our own domestic agenda, we are so in favour of leaning in with developing countries, supporting them around this finance, but we do need to kind of take a really serious look around how we can close that adaptation gap on financing. I do think there is a role to play from the private sector, and speak carefully about how, but again, it's kind of that kind of horses for courses, and or what is the right method. So within mitigation, you've really seen the private sector leaning in. There's huge markets, and in many ways, I hope that with future near-term political changes, the private sector that is opportunities that are already marching forwards around mitigation will mean that it's not a complete step back from the mitigation side, and there are opportunities within resilience as well. But we need to be really aware where public finance is still needed within resilience, and not pretend that private money will just sort of fill this gap. You know, I'm going to keep going back to Chad just because it's the fore of my mind, and or I have previously worked in South Sudan and places where, you know, investments aren't just going to flow because the risks are just too high. You know, it's just too high. And as a donor, we have opportunities to de-risk and kind of support that. But also, you know, these are problems that aren't going to go away when the private sector they're not going to come in and save the day. But we also need to kind of work together around kind of with the finite resources we have, like how can we really have a kind of a longer term impact. And, you know, we are pushing within the NCQG around the kind of, for there to be more money available for LDCs, more targeted money, and so that it kind of goes to the most vulnerable. And then, and on the kind of, on the overall context and content, we're very aware, kind of looking at the adaptation gap report, that we're not going to close this overnight. So I'm afraid I don't have a long list of answers. We're very keen to kind of come to the table and talk about and work out what we can do most pragmatically. And yes, food should really be at the top of the agenda. Although my water colleagues tell me water should come first, because without water you can't grow food. Although then you talk to our health colleagues and we keep going down this argument. But I think our food should be on the podium for sure. We don't need to argue whether it's on top or second place to water.
Thank you so much, and apologies for the ambush. I think it was a relevant ambush, otherwise I would have been ruled out of order. But I know Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance and the team here can actually have a true ally in you in terms of furthering that conversation and ensuring it becomes a reality. I want to open it to the floor so that again we get 2 questions only. Two questions. Any question from the floor? Any comment? As you cook your question, but cook them. Don't overcook them. Huh? Let me pass over back to Tom.
Sorry, just while we wait for some amazing questions from the crowd. Okay, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I mean, Peter earlier mentioned the 40% waste on food, right? I think there's probably 40% waste in our aid system right now. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have to solve from the global north, is thinking about, you mentioned earlier, locally led adaptation. How do we get the money down to communities? How do we get it really spent where it's going to be spent in the most effective, efficient way? Because, you know, I'm part of this global aid complex as much as everybody else, but I at least recognize where that waste is happening, and it horrifies me every day. And I think that we have to be more responsible and not to be trying to make efficiently quick decisions to give all of our money to, you mentioned one of my favorites earlier, which I won't name check now, but some of these large UN organizations that do suck up a lot of the money, and a lot of it doesn't flow down. So I do think we have to not just blame the farmer for the waste of their food, but also blame the aid system for the waste of our aid. That wasn't a question, but I just wanted to say it.
Very useful perspective, and indeed, Pacha will have a further conversation today at Mali Pavilion between the hour of 4 on the same question, which is extremely an important question. Any comment, any observation?
Thank you very much. I am Azeh from Union of Ethiopian Women and Children Associations. I just want to raise boldly, in addition to you raised all on the crisis to funding, especially for local community, especially particularly women-focused organizations. We are saying women-focused attention has to be given for women-focused organizations to create access to fund, because we are talking about the 50% of the agriculture, as you said, it has to be focused on agriculture. 50% of the labor force of agriculture, and about 30% of the low productivity. Women have less productive than men by 30%. So we are talking about 50% of the agricultural labor force has low productivity. Unless otherwise we enhance the productivity of the 50% of agricultural labor force, how could we realize the development? So I just want to thank you for raising the issues, and I wanted to be serious, to give serious attention for allocating finance aligning with the indicators that are set in all global, national, or development agendas, even climate-related or sustainable development goal-related indicators. We need to allocate and efficiently utilize the fund allocated in line with the indicators that are set in development agenda. Thank you very much.
Any final one? Thank you so much. I'll allocate 1 minute per each of the panelists for closing comments, and then we can move to the final part of this program. Just 1 minute each, and pass the mic.
I mean, I don't think I need a minute. I think we've pretty much wrapped it up here. I think we recognise that there is huge gaps. There's a huge need to improve the flows and the processes by which aid and climate finance gets down to the people on the ground who need to deliver. And I think, you know, we all recognise it, but it's what we need to do next is the challenge, and how do we fix that? We need to take this forward and make actions.
Yeah, thank you very much. What I wanted to reiterate again is also the need for building capacity at both strategic and operational level. That is really going to be very much important because as we discuss, making the fund flow directly to the grassroots, but also we need to consider that, building capacity, there must be a resource to build capacity at a ministerial level and also, at a regional and a zonal level, because if there is no strong capacity, implementation capacity at a higher level, even if the resources come, it is going to be, very much difficult to monitor the implementation and also strengthen the reporting one. And the partnership, what I wanted to again, re-emphasize, I mean, as we disperse, then I will be alone. Then when I am alone, then, you can imagine my capacity. But if we reorganize ourselves, build a very strong, partnership, this could be along gender, maybe around gender, around the private sector, around adaptation, so on and so forth. And then, that will give us, the privilege to, push our voice heard, mobilize resource. Not specifically, we need to avoid this sectoral focus. So we need to really work together by bringing different ministries and also by, collaborating with an institution in our neighboring countries. That is also what is missing. For instance, I don't have a single project that I have been implementing with a neighboring country. If you come to me, like Green Legacy Initiative, this is the largest landscape restoration in Africa. But we are doing it alone. We are calling to the neighboring countries to join us, but no one has, show up. And that is also very much important, the need for collaboration, partnership between government and also CBOs, so on. Yeah, that is what I wanted to conclude.
So thank you so much. Allow me to react to one important issue that he actually raised, the issues of rock rising, action, ensuring that money reaches the communities at the front line. Now, the statistics we have from Africa is that it's only 10% of the mega climate finance that comes to Africa that actually reaches the grassroots communities. And that is scaring. And even that 10%, we are not very sure whether communities had the urgency or whether they took lead in prioritization and in framing of the projects on the ground. And that one tells you there's a very big gap. But most importantly, just to mention that I would want to probably bring to your attention, to the issues of the principles of rock-related climate actions. You can actually be able to go read them. PACJA contributed into formulation of those principles of rock-related climate actions, talking about flexibilities, access, predictability of the finances, and again, even addressing structural inequalities and all that. You'll be able to look at all those, principles. They are very important in ensuring that the programs that we actually create, they are responsive to the needs of the communities on the grassroots. And make no mistake, sometimes what we call localized climate actions are not. The fact that communities are benefiting from a certain climate response action does not mean that you have attained localization. We need to see systematic involvement of communities, but you need to go a notch higher and also ensure that communities at the very grassroots are taking lead in prioritization and in framing of the projects on the ground. We actually have 5 levels, of localization. And I think I would interest you in reading through to ensure that the projects that we're implementing and that we're actually also assessing really meet, that particular criteria. Because we think by communities benefiting, we think that we have actually attained, a local level kind of intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I also want to say something on localization because it is about quantity, but it's also about quality, the quality of relationship between local actors and intermediary organizations and donors as well, national and local actors. We did some assessments and during COVID, localization had improved a lot because frontline communities were responding to humanitarian crises, emergencies, and so on. But the data shows you that immediately after COVID, in fact, it went back pre-grand bargain, the localization status. So we need to recognize, of course, that I did some assessment in disability and humanitarian actually on localization, and I had the privilege of interviewing some donors, and you cannot blame them because they also operate with lean staff from more foreign affairs, But there are donors like USAID. They have the locally led development, for instance. FCD also are trying. They have best practices. It's just that we are not documenting them. For instance, in a consortium, USAID, I think it's USAID, that insists that in a consortium, halfway or by the end of the project, they want to see that the local actor takes over the project and runs it. So there are best practices and innovative approaches out there. But of course, in certain sectors, for instance, in disability, as I was here, for instance, you would know that, in fact, what we are seeing is as indirectly as possible. That's how finance is flowing. Yeah.
Thank you. In case you missed it, there was a positive towards FCD on the UK just in this intervention briefly from my colleague. I'm just going to capitalise on that briefly. So everyone's talking about substance. But just to come back to the title about access to finance and things, this is a huge challenge. You see it time and time again with countries, and there's a real ambition, particularly from the UK and others. We need to improve this. We need to look at these kind of how the finance is flowing and where it's flowing, and just the time scales. We talked about 18 months, even 18 months, unfortunately, is often a short time scale within some of the funds. And, within adaptation, not only is it contextual, but it's time framed as well. And often we hear the feedback that actually by the time a project is funded, the situation has changed, got worse, or, the project is. So, and we are acutely aware of this, and we need to really push, if we're going to have if there's an ambitious, as I hope there will be, NCQG, this money needs to be accessible and it needs to be able to flow. And I think we need to keep being held to account for it, but we're very much holding ourselves to account for this as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The event is not over. We have 6-7 minutes before we close, and we want to close powerfully. I would request the panelists to take their seat. And as they take their seat, Miraria Tembo, who is a passionate young activist, and again a CEO of Cherry Orchard Farm, but more importantly, she has been associated with Ban Ki-moon Center, will actually give us a final push for this particular conversation by giving us the call to action out of this particular conversation. Thanks, and over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry. My name is Mirirai Tembo, and I am the founder of the Cherry Orchard Farm. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm the founder of the Cherry Orchard Farm in Zambia, and I'm also the 2024 Ban Ki-moon Agri Champion. At the Cherry Orchard Farm, we grow and process sunflower into cooking oil. We chose sunflower because over the past 2 decades, our community has faced increasingly unpredictable rainfall patterns. To adapt, we needed a drought-tolerant crop, and sunflower was an ideal choice. We also saw the importance of creating market access for farmers in our community, ensuring they have opportunities to thrive and benefit economically from their hard work. Thank you all for gathering here. to address one of the most pressing challenges of our time, securing meaningful commitments for climate financing that can truly support adaptation, especially in agriculture. As we consider the UAE Belém work plan, let's recognize that it isn't just about meeting a global goal on adaptation, it's about making sure that our farmers, especially our smallholder farmers, have the resources they need to withstand, adapt, and thrive amid climate impacts. The stakes have never been higher. Research from the Sahel and East Africa shows that while climate finance flows are increasing, the funding often fails to reach the people on the ground. Despite the need, smallholders only receive 0.8% of total climate finance, which is inadequate. As the Youth Agri-Champions with the Ban Ki-moon Center, we call on climate finance institutions to simplify and streamline application, compliance, and reporting processes. We ask to eliminate bureaucracy and remove unnecessary barriers that prevent smallholder farmers from accessing urgently needed funds. We ask for more accessible and increased grant financing, more grants and not loans, to prevent worsening the debt crisis in vulnerable regions. We also urge policymakers and researchers to prioritize effective communication. Critical adaptation information should be accessible, timely, and in languages and formats that resonate at the community level. This isn't just about information, it's about empowerment, allowing communities to make informed decisions about their futures. As a farmer myself, I understand the urgent need for climate finance in my community and country. This year, we experienced the worst drought in Zambia, and it has affected our food security, energy sector, and overall well-being. Looking at the last 2 decades and seeing how the rainfall pattern has been declining, I know it's only going to get worse. So something needs to be done. So today is not just a gathering, it's an opportunity to forge stronger commitments and set a new precedent in climate financing that empowers those who produce our food and steward our lands. Together, let's drive meaningful change that supports resilience from the ground up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mirari. I think that was our closing part. Again, for this particular event, it's important to keep the conversation alive. The journey ahead is quite long, again with challenges, but I think we have a conceptual outlook of how we need to move. Let's shape this further. I know next year, PACT are working with others, and we want you to be part of that particular process. We'll be convening the second conference on accelerating agricultural adaptation in Africa. It is this partnership in its breadth, plus others, that we want to ensure that they are part of that particular process and that we are able to pitch agriculture in the GGA at the height of the conversation.